If you're online, say hi on the chat. I really rather like that. Piano quartets of Robert Schumann, or are they the trios? Anyway, Robert Schumann. Oscar Wilde was quite fond of Schumann. He mentioned his song cycle in The Picture of Dorian Gray, I think it was. I see our first to the chat line is Nancy. Hello, Nancy. Welcome. Quite looking forward to this myself. Hello, Joan. Susan and Kathleen, welcome to you. Hello, James and Bethany. And Christine. We'll be starting in 7 or 8 minutes. Good day to you, William. For those of you who are interested, and if you can hear the music in the background, it is typical for the period. It's Robert Schumann. Oscar was very fond of Schumann, and he might have been the relatively modern go-to composer of the time. Quite like him myself. I see a conversation on the chat line going on between all the Christines. Hello, Christines. What I like about the Schumann music is that it's always sort of delightful and pleasant, and then suddenly it turns a corner and there's a dark, ominous undertone to it, which pretty much sums up Oscar Wilde's life. Aaron, we always try to be delightful with the music, and I try to pick it to be suitable to the particular writer that I'm talking about. And Schumann is right for the period, and also for Oscar. I hope everybody is still staying sane with the lock-in. It's a bit like hell on earth. But I like other people's company. I used to like my company, but I'm beginning to go off me. I don't think I'm as amusing as I used to be, and in fact, I'm sick of the sight of me. But anyway, I hope you're all very well and very safe, and I hope you're all still washing your hands and taking care of yourself. We have a friend from the San Francisco Bay Area. That's Jim. Hello, Jim. Somebody from Cork, Nicola. Hello, Nicola. You were here last week, I remember. In fact, last week I think we extended our range of listeners or viewerships. We entered Poland with 5 foreign nations, and that's pretty good. I'm delighted with that because, you know, I'll talk to anybody, no matter where you are. Well, it's lovely that that you're tuning in from such distances. There you are. Hello, Stefania. Stefania is from Bergamo in Italy, which, bless them, is the epicenter of the whole Italian outbreak of the virus, and they've had a terrible time there. So deep sympathy there. Nice comment from Mary there. The lockdown is appropriate in the circumstances given poor Oscar's time in prison. He was in lockdown for 2 years with hard labor. At least most of us are in lockdown with reasonably full refrigerators and plenty of toilet paper. What is this thing about toilet paper? Why are people obsessed with having toilet paper? I do not know. Eat less. Dave, you don't get a diploma or a certificate, but you have the enormous self-satisfaction of knowing that you put up with me for 5 hours over 5 weeks. You should be very, very proud of yourself. How am I doing my notes together? Information notes. You're all joining in a mad rush now, so hello everybody. Let me start in a few moments. No, actually, John Matthew, no, I don't remove any of the books except unless I'm reading them or researching on them. But at the moment, they just sort of sit there. That's only a bit of it. In fact, you should see, if you can see in the corner, you can see my little sunroom, which has in fact got infinitely more books in it than the shelves behind me. I'm one of those people who just believes that it is better to have more books than fewer books, and always have at least a large stack of books that you have yet to read, because that way you are never alone. There's always something, mind you, you always have the responsibility of, and the guilt. Oh my God, I didn't read that book and I spent X dollars on it, So yeah, I do feel guilty about the fact the number of books I haven't read, but I'm also one of those people who tends to read 3 books at a time. You put one down, you pick up another, and keeps the mind active, which at my age is a great difficulty. I agree, John. You can get over that guilt very easily. Okay, we're going to make a start. So I'm going to, as usual, gently fade the music away because I'll start listening to it and get completely distracted. So welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us again. Our topic today is Oscar Wilde, but before we get there, there's a little bit of housekeeping to do. First, we have to congratulate Deborah Frauenholz, who won the trivia question last week. The trivia question was, who is the current owner of Drury Lane Theatre in London? And the answer, of course, is the man who pretty much owns the rest of the West End as well, Andrew Lloyd Webber. That's the principle. If you want to have a show on in a theatre, buy the theatre first. So Andrew Lloyd Webber is the owner of it. It's a magnificent theatre. If you are in London, if you've never been there, go. It's a glorious, glorious, classic, huge, beautiful place. Kind of thing I would never put a play on in. But if you're going to do a big musical, do a big musical in the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. At the time when it was owned by Garrick and Sheridan and such, it was a much smaller building, probably seating maybe 200 to 300 people. But now I think it seats well in excess of 1,000, and it is glorious. So anyway, there you are. That was last week's. There will be a trivia question at the end of this week's program. I want to say thank you to all the donors. After last week's program, and indeed right up to yesterday, there were people making donations. We are deeply grateful. It's really important that we get those donations in order that we keep going. The same is true for all the arts organizations in Pittsburgh. All the organizations are putting out various programs and readings and activities, because we are not allowed to gather you together in confined spaces, and that may not happen for quite a considerable period of time. We've all got to keep operating in some way, shape, or form, so your dollars are so important. Every donation you make, no matter how small it is, really, really matters. And so I ask you, in all humility, please keep sending those dollars. You can go onto our website, you can do it on our emails, you'll find the big red button, and if you can't find the big red button, just send a check. But please, please, please do keep supporting, because that's the only way we can survive. And we want to come out at the end of this still able to bring you what we believe is some of the finest theatre the professional theatre in Pittsburgh can provide. So thank you again. So anyway, that's enough of that. This week, we're going to continue our little investigation into the Irishing of English theatre. And to recap very briefly, the whole principle of this is that at the time, and pretty much up to the final and full establishment of the Irish state as a republic, an independent republic, the capital was London. And when one wants to succeed, one tends to move to the biggest center that a nation has. It's different in America because it's not the capital, it's either New York or LA, because you want to go for Broadway or Hollywood. But in most countries, it is the capital. If it's France, it's Paris. If it's Germany, it's Berlin. If it's Australia, it's Sydney. But in England, in Britain, in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, as it was back in the day, it was London. And so to London went many a creative artist from all over that United Kingdom. And so therefore did the Irish. And as we have seen in the last two talks, both George Farquhar and Richard Brinsley Sheridan had a huge impact on the development of English theatre writing post the Commonwealth, after the theatres reopened, with the restoration not merely of the monarchy, but of art and of entertainment. The Irish writers were in there with a huge degree of influence and creative imagination. Sheridan, not only writing plays but also managing theatres, owning them, buying up a theatre, the Drury Lane, becoming a member of Parliament. He was a British politician. He was engaged and involved in the whole American Revolutionary movement, in that he supported it. So you had this deep influence of Irish writers, of Irish creative artists, on the fabric of English society. So this week, we address somebody who I believe did more for that than anyone who preceded him. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. There's a mouthful. There is a name and a half. Oscar Wilde was, to my mind, and I've said it before and I'll keep on saying it, one of the most gifted, imaginative, inventive, creative, opinionated, self-satisfied, self-indulgent, self-pitying, and ultimately self-destructive artists that Ireland ever produced. His ego knew no bounds. His modesty was barely existent, in public at any rate. And he had an enormous effect on creative writing for the theatre during a very brief period of time. Because for all he wrote, for all he did, because he didn't simply write plays, he wrote books, he wrote commentary, he wrote journalism, he was an essayist, he was a poet, and all of this happened in a very relatively brief period of time, 25 years perhaps, because the man died when he was 46 years old. He didn't even make 50. Nor did he make the 20th century, because he died in 1900. And in those days, we counted the year, the 100 year, as the last of the century, not the first of the next. Anyway, he was born on October 16th in 1854. Point about that, our timeline that we were talking about, Oscar was born 38 years after the death of Richard Brinsley Sheridan. Sheridan was born 40 years after the death of George Farquhar. Farquhar was born 70 years after the death of William Shakespeare. So I want us to keep that linear thing in our minds. As I say, he was born in 1854, but one of Oscar's great failings, perhaps, was his enormous vanity. So he would very often give the year of his birth as 1856. He would like to take 2 years off it. Always lied about his age. In fact, as he observed in one of his plays later on, no woman should ever be entirely accurate about her age. It looks so calculating. The epigram was, I suppose you might say, Oscar's the thing that Oscar could do without even thinking it. Some people can do tricks, some people can do magic, some people can do card tricks. Oscar could create epigrams almost on on a breath. Somebody once asked him, I think in the Café Royal, somebody attempted to test him by saying, "Is it true that you can create an epigram on any subject?" And Oscar replied, "Yes." And the wit said, "All right then, the Queen," to which Oscar immediately replied, "The Queen is not a subject." He, as I say, he was renowned for this capacity. But and I'm always being asked, because I've worked on Oscar Wilde as a writer. I've done recitals and readings, and I've done every one of his plays, both as an actor and as a director. So I'm always being asked, what's my favorite quote? And I share this. Fortunately for me, I became very good friends with Oscar's grandson, Merlin Holland. And we both agree on the best of Oscar's quotes. And it is, in fact, the title of this particular talk. When Oscar was asked a question about something or other, his response was, "I am a man of simple tastes. I am easily satisfied with the best." And that's pretty much sums him up. For all the rest of his wit, for all the other wonderful sayings that he came out with, such as, work is the curse of the drinking classes, he was not unwilling to steal as well. There was the famous case when Whistler, the painter, a great friend of Oscar's, made some comment about something or the other, and Oscar replied, said to him, "Oh, dear, Whistler, I wish I'd said that," to which Whistler replied, "You will, Oscar, you will. Don't call it plagiarism, call it research," was Oscar's great principle, I think. He was born in the city of Dublin at 21 Westland Row, and he was the son of Sir William Wilde, who was himself an incredibly brilliant mind. He was a doctor. He set up his practice as an eye and ear surgeon. He received his knighthood because he was appointed as the eye and ear surgeon to Her Majesty Queen Victoria when in Ireland, and at that time it was still part of her domain. They moved, because he started to make money, around the corner to a much more prestigious address at number 1 Merrion Square. Now, if you go to Dublin, you go to Merrion Square. That square, big, beautiful Georgian square, on one side of it is the National Gallery and the government buildings, Leinster House, and on the other 3 sides are these beautiful Georgian houses. And number 1 Merrion Square, on a corner, it's now occupied by the American University. Merrion Square was the home of what one might describe as the senior literati, the political class, the thinking classes, the intelligentsia of Dublin at that time. And to live there meant you were somebody, and also that you had money. So William was, apart from being a doctor, he was a historian, an antiquarian, an archaeologist. He wrote biographies of Jonathan Swift, or a biographer. He was married to this remarkable woman, Jane Francesca Elgee, and she was known amongst her intimates as Speranza, and was a very fabled hostess. And she also wrote some very indifferent revolutionary poetry, because at this particular point, we were at what one might call the growth period of Irish nationalism, which, as it turned to the end of the century and into the new century, into the beginning of the 20th century, turned into a total revolution and the Easter Rising and all of that. But she wrote an awful lot of revolutionary poetry. She was a very modern woman. Today, we would think of her as a leader in the women's liberation movement, but she was deeply, deeply, deeply committed to the idea of the feminine, of womanhood, of womankind. She also had a huge influence on Oscar. He once wrote, when he was young, wrote to a friend, I want to introduce you to my mother. We have founded a society for the suppression of virtue. Her wit, her own, she ran a salon, which was a center for arts and politics in Dublin. All that literati, all that intelligentsia, they would pass through her rooms, through her salon, and Oscar at her skirts would be listening to and partaking in this world of intelligent conversation. And I think that's the most important thing about this aspect of his life, that he was exposed constantly to intelligent conversation. He was sent to Portrayed Royal School in Enniskillen, which was a school for wealthy Protestants in Ireland at the time. And as Sheridan before him and Samuel Beckett after him, went to Trinity College. After a couple of years in Trinity, he then went to Oxford, to Magdalen College. And it's a rather important development. He was here that he studied what was called Greeks, which was pretty much ancient Greek and Latin. And his, I think we used as the teaser this week the story of him going for his vocal examination. where he arrived very late and soaking wet because of a huge rainstorm, and spent 5 or 10 minutes apologizing profusely for the state of himself, the badness of the weather, and the fact that he was late, and that the examiners told him basically to go home because for the entire conversation he'd been speaking in conversational ancient Greek. His capacity for language was quite remarkable. He spoke flawless French. Which is a part of the key to Oscar. And if you study Oscar, you realize that what his passion was, what his true love was language, was the use of language. His early exposure to intelligent conversation, the intelligent use of words, the construct in conversation of how words were built, and his mother's ability to turn those conversations on their head and make witticisms out of them all the time. I had such a deep influence on him, it stayed with him for his life. Studying literature, studying ancient literature, studying ancient Greek, ancient Latin, it, as it were, invaded his imagination in such a way that everything that came out of him later on was to do with language. He was described, I think it was Posey Douglas, his lover, who described him as the Lord of Language. And that is exactly what he was, his capacity to use words. After Oxford, he moved to London because he had a desire, a wish, and an ambition to become famous. He also, at that point, started to drop the names. He made a comment about that. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde was something of a mouthful. He dropped the Fingal O'Flaherty Wills, and he did make the comment that one day he will jettisons them like one jettisons sand from a balloon so that one can rise higher. He then said eventually he would jettison one of the other names and be known simply as the Oscar or the Wilde, which was deeply prophetic, because nowadays when you just say Oscar or Wilde, you pretty much know who you're referring to. His fame grew rapidly, or sometimes occasions his infamy. Again, he was on the Strand in London one day, and he heard two gentlemen walked past him, and one of them said to the other, "Isn't that damn fool Oscar Wilde?" And Oscar knew he had arrived. If you are being ridiculed on the street, you are now somebody. He developed a passion for what one might describe as the new thinking, and that was deeply feminist. And his co-Dubliner Shaw also had a fascination for that. You will notice that for both writers, and Oscar to a great degree, the major protagonists in most of his plays and the major topic in most of his plays are women. Women suddenly started to move into their rightful position in society. The fact that there was a queen on the throne and had been there for quite some considerable period of time probably had a great influence on this. At one point, he became the editor of a magazine, which was called The Ladies' World. He changed the title to The Woman's World, which may not seem as significant at the moment. When you think back into that mid to late Victorian period, was quite a major step to say, no, ladies are not what this is about. Women is what this is about. And he also did something that was quite unthinkable to a degree at that time. He engaged women to write for the magazine. I mean, if you're going to have a magazine called Women's World, you really should have women writing for it. It was a novel idea in the late Victorian period. And it was around that time that he began to write for the theatre. Now, it wasn't instant success because, like every writer, he needed to find his hand. He needed to find himself as a writer and work out what he actually wanted to say. And like an awful lot of people who start to write for the theatre, they start by copying. Oh, well, that worked for so-and-so, I'm going to do that. That worked for so-and-so, I'm going to do that. The early plays, he wrote verse plays that were dreadful. He tried to write political plays, but he couldn't resist the idea of being amusing. He tried to write romantic plays. They were short. They were not very good. But eventually he found his hand. And it came from the fact, I believe, that he He inherited a terribly important thing from the Irish psyche. Like Sheridan, like Farquhar, but in a way clearer in Oscar, he became, to my mind, the Shanachi, the Irish word for the storyteller. I remember putting this forward at a debate once and being told I was ridiculous, but that he would have known nothing about that. But I did point out that his father owned a house in the west of Ireland on Loch Corrib, north of Galway. That his father was an antiquarian, his mother was a collector of Irish folk tales, and that not only did they have that house, but they also owned a small fishing cottage in County Sligo, I think, can't remember the name of it now, it's gone out of my head. But he was at that time, in that period in Irish history, the west of Ireland was still almost third world in terms of the small villages, the isolated communities. And his mother and his father would go around collecting stories, collecting songs, collecting tales. Oscar would have been part of that. He was not the effete thing that people think of him. He was my size. And if you know me, I'm 6'4" and bulky. And when he would go to the West, he would be out hunting, shooting, fishing, rowing on Loch Corrib. He was athletic. He was strong. There was the wonderful incident when the Marquis of Queensberry brought two of his grooms to Oscar's house in Tite Street to rough him up a bit, and Oscar actually threw them both out onto the street, punched them both out onto the street. He was a tough man. Anyway, I digress. He understood the nature of storytelling. He understood how to compose a story and how to tell it. And he also understood that no story is valid unless it has a moral point. There must be a point to a story. It must have a conclusion that either annoys, aggravates, satisfies, or amuses, and preferably all of those things. So when he started writing well, when he started composing the 4, and in fact the 5 plays, I'm just going to deal with 4 of them for the moment. There is a 5th. But the 4 principal plays, Lady Windermere's Fan, An Ideal Husband, Woman of No Importance, and The Importance of Being Earnest, each of these plays, apart from being phenomenally amusing and phenomenally entertaining, still now into 20 years into the 21st century, are still as utterly entertaining, as utterly amusing as they were at the end of the 19th century. That's an achievement. And the reason they are is because they are amusing, they are entertaining, they are educative. They have a moral center to them, and they have a conclusion that should satisfy. One of the things that Oscar was conscious of at the time, I'm certain, was that there was an image of the stage Irishman. It was illustrated by Punch magazine, and it was usually somebody wearing breeches with bad stockings and a waistcoat and a tailcoat, carrying a shillelagh with a broken nose and a battered top hat. And that was the image that you had of the drunken fighting Irishman. Oscar, I think, created, and I'm not alone in this one, the image of the stage Englishman. And in fact, in many ways, Oscar almost defined the way the Englishman should look and behave. He established a kind of rule of manners through his plays for how the English should behave. And there are images of him. He has a famous set of photographs taken in I think it was in New York, wearing velvet and with knee breeches and the whole look. I have a photograph of myself dressed in that costume from when I appeared as Oscar at the Abbey Theatre. That's not me in the black and white. That's me in the top left corner with the blue background. But if you look at that carefully, it is a pastiche of the classic stage Irishman look converted to the stage Englishman upper class look. It is in so many ways a satire of the Englishman's satire of the Irishman. Oscar is inverting, turning it on its head. That's the way Oscar often worked, the turning of an idea on its head, such as drink or work is the curse of the drinking classes. It's a brilliant inversion, and Oscar used that all the time. I do believe that that costume, in many ways, was a clever inversion of what the way that the English had represented the Irish. Anyway, to move on, Oscar almost defined the way that that the upper class, the aristocracy, behaved, and he lampooned it savagely, because as a storyteller, part of that part of the motif of the satire was to demonstrate the absurdities within the aristocracy. They were his audience, but they were also his subject of ridicule. So you have characters within those plays who will satirize themselves. In An Ideal Husband, you had the character of Lord Goring, who talks about the fact that most of these people adored themselves. And he talks to his butler and has the Phipps, I am the only person of the smallest importance in London at present who wears a buttonhole. You see, Phipps, fashion is what one wears oneself. What is unfashionable is what other people wear. Just as vulgarity is simply the conduct of other people, and falsehood the truths of other people. Other people are quite dreadful. The only possible society is oneself. To love oneself is the beginning of a lifelong romance. It is a glorious little speech, and it so perfectly typifies that kind of arrogance, that subtle, gentle, amusing arrogance of the English upper classes at the time, and possibly even now. Society was the thing to be in. I'll come to where society lived in a moment. Lord Illingworth, in A Woman of No Importance, talked about it. Society is a necessary thing. To be in it is merely a bore, but to be out of it is simply a tragedy. No man has any real success in this world unless he has got women to back him, and women rule society. If you have not got women on your side, you are quite over. And that was very true, that the growth, the rise of the power of women, probably thanks to the fact that there was a lady on the throne and stayed there for 60 years. He also goes on about and the way one should look and the way one should behave. One should learn how to tie. Jared, he's talking to the young man in the play. You should learn how to tie your tie better. Sentiment is all very well for the buttonhole, but the essential thing for a necktie is style. A well-tied tie is the first serious step in life. And we think, oh, don't be ridiculous. But for them, it was. Because style was far more superior to substance. Substance was wealth. And if you had it, you didn't need to fight for it, you didn't need to prove it, you simply lived gloriously, and therefore you worried about the state of your necktie. Lady Bracknell, in fact, does mention that same thought in The Importance of Being Earnest, when she says well, Algernon speaks somewhat against the notion of society. She replies, never speak disrespectfully of society, Algernon. Only people who can't get into it do that. And that is also a great truth and a great reversal. At a time when society is always wealth wrapped up in a new definition. Aristocrats, the aristocracy, are only people whose ancestors carried bigger swords than yours. The ancestral line, well, my family went back to William the Conqueror. Well, actually, so did mine. It's just that your family perhaps had a bigger sword, whacked a lot more people, and managed to build a castle. Your family possibly paid money to the king and got a title. That's the only difference. But as that passes down generation to generation to generation, and wealth allows one the relaxation and the ability to simply indulge in style rather than substance, you develop an aristocratic line, a breed. You have developed good breeding. Now, let's have a little word about that as well. Two things that Oscar writes about that are I think, the two central themes in these plays. are the two C's, class and corruption. And class tends to produce corruption. The famous phrase of Lord Acton, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and power comes from wealth. Without wealth, you cannot have power. Now, somebody will inevitably argue with me and say, well, no, there's moral power and moral strength. Yes, of course there is. But I quote, I think it was Ogden Nash, the best things in life may be free, but have you ever tried to get any of them without money? It is wonderful to walk upon a beach or through a forest, but if you can't afford to eat and you haven't got the transport to get there, how can you enjoy it? Money, or the means of wealth, is the means to get us everything in life. Oscar understood that, and he understood that that was, in fact, corrupting. And it was class that tended, and every society develops class. Even in our classless, wonderful classless society in America, we have class. We even talk about it. We're proud of saying, well, we are middle class, as if it was something that makes us better than blue collar, because we don't like to use the word working class as if it was in some way demeaning. So we'll say blue collar, but we will say middle class. We don't have an upper class, but we do have aristocracy, and they're usually politicians, and they're usually very wealthy. Breeding was important. Now, we talk about breeding as if it's something to do with the way you behave and the manners you have and all of that, and of course it is. But what does it actually come down to? All the aristocracy, in any country that developed an aristocracy, all of them are just the descendants of farmers, because they had land. They either bought the land, won the land, killed people for the land, but they ended up with land. And because they had land, they could breed. They could breed amongst themselves. But we use the term breeding to imply that they have, in some way, they are better human beings, that they have got better manners, they're better read, they've got all of those things. The word breeding is really important because these were farming stock. And one of the things you do if you are, let's say you're you're running cattle or sheep or pigs or whatever, you want to make sure that your herd stays good. So when it comes to ensuring that you've got new growth, you want new lambs, new calves to build the herd, to develop the herd. You want to make sure that the heifers, if it's I do know agriculture, that the heifers are crossed by a really good bull, and you'll pay good money for it. Same with fillies. If you're running horses, you want a really good stallion. Same with sheep. You want a good ram. So what you do is you go out and look for a really good sire to breed with your feminine stock. Every aristocratic society did the same, and in England it was called the season. And part of the season was that the debutantes, the young daughters who had come of age, would be paraded at various debutante balls and presented to the king or queen, in this case. And at these balls, young men would come and deals would be struck between parents to make sure that the right filly was crossed with the correct sire, that the couples would marry off to produce good breeding stock or well-bred stock. It was a cattle market. And Oscar understood that as well, and he actually ridicules that in The Importance of Being Earnest, and I'll come to that now. But breeding was all about maintaining the breed in the way that one maintains the cattle breed, the horse breed, the sheep breed, the whatever breed, the dog breed. The various dog shows around the world are just a pastiche of the season in London. He ridicules this brilliantly in The Importance of Being Earnest. We have one of my all-time favorite characters, one of everybody's all-time favorite characters. He created a lady of aristocratic name who may not herself be of aristocratic blood, but certainly knows how to maintain it. She is Lady Bracknell. And Lady Bracknell, who I must say among all the wonderful roles I've actually had the privilege of playing in my career, she's one of my favorite. I did actually get to play Lady Bracknell at the Abbey Theatre, and also I played it again here in Pittsburgh with PICT. We replicated the production here. But Lady Bracknell is one of the truly great monsters, and probably could out-dragon all the dragons in Game of Thrones. And she is a classic example, or the way she is created is a classic example of the way Oscar turns breeding on its head in this sense. He goes from breeding as in good breeding, as in aristocracy, to breeding as in good breeding, as in maintaining the stock. When she begins to interview Jack Worthing about the possibility of marrying her daughter Gwendolyn, I'm not just going to read you that first introduction. I feel bound to tell you that you are not down on my list of eligible young men. My list of eligible young men. Although I have the same list as the dear Duchess of Bolton has. We work together, in fact. So you see, already he's immediately addressing the fact that this is not a game of love. This is a game of stock breeding. And she and the Duchess of Bolton have similar lists to find out who is the appropriate young man to cross with their daughters to produce further stock. She goes on, however, I'm quite ready to enter your name should your answers be what a really affectionate mother requires. Now, affectionate is a joke. It has nothing to do with affection. Her first question, do you smoke? He admits that he does, which she's delighted because she believes that every man should have an occupation. What he's parodying there is the fact that if you are a true aristocrat and if you have true wealth and true position in society, you don't do a job. If you have a job, you are middle class. She then goes on to ask about his age, his education, if any, his income, and his property. And all of those prove satisfactory. He's the right age. He is dim. He hasn't got a lot of education. He has a good income, so he can sustain not only his wife, but possibly Lady Bracknell as well. And he has property, both a house in town and in the country. So that gives all the things that a mother seriously wants for her daughter's happiness. Then she goes on to minor matters. His parents, at which point he admits that he doesn't have any, that he was found. And there's the wonderful story about being found in a handbag in Victoria Station. But this is the point. He has no class. He was found in a handbag. He is probably illegitimate. He therefore cannot enter society. He would be a blemish on the breed. If he cannot prove, and when we talk about breeding, I remember, however many of you might remember the TV series Roots, and that wonderful moment when he is asking the plantation owner about slave lists, and the owner says, "No, we don't. We never had anything." And then he realizes it's a stock breeding farm, breeding horses, and he says, "Have you got stock breeding lists for the horses?" And they take down the books and they open them up, and there are the list of slave names and the breeding of new slaves listed as stock breeding. This is what Oscar is parodying. This is exactly what was going on in society all over Europe and in America in the latter half of the 19th century and well into the early part of the 20th as well. So therefore, because he cannot prove his parentage, because they can't, in fact, the English had two well-known stock breeding books. One's called Debrett's and the other's called Burke's Peerage, because the English are terribly fussy about who you are and where you're from. I remember a very old friend of mine, and he's an aristocrat, talking about, if you want to pretend that you are an aristocrat, you could pretend you're an Italian because nobody knows who they are. And you can pretend to be French because most of them got killed off during the unpleasantness known as the French Revolution. But you can never get away with it in the UK. You can't get away with it in England. because they know seed, breed, and generation, who is married to who. Nobody marries first or second cousins. They want to keep the breed pure. They do not want to diminish it, and they don't want to start producing imbecilic children. So they're very, very fussy, and they know who everybody is. And so you have this wonderful situation set up, and then Oscar continues that parody, and he continues to satirize them. He can't marry her because he has no name. But the Lady Bracknell's nephew wants to marry Jack's ward, and he's in love with her, and it's all lovely and gooey and delightful. But Lady Bracknell absolutely refuses to allow this to happen because nobody knows who she is, and she's certainly not an aristocrat, and she's probably middle class, until it is discovered that she is a fabulous heiress. She has a huge amount of money that she will inherit. At which point, as far as Lady Bracknell is concerned, it is perfectly okay for Algy to marry her. Money rules all. Wealth is class. We go on with the plot that Jack refuses to let his niece marry Algy until it is discovered that Jack Worthing isn't in fact Jack Worthing. He is actually Ernest. He is actually the elder brother of Algy. He is the actual other nephew of Lady Bracknell, and she gives consent that he can marry Gwendolen. And what a lot of people miss with that one, there's an important point there. Jack, or Ernest, and Gwendolen are first cousins, and they break every single rule, including the rules of the Church of England, by the fact that they get married. So in other words, in order to satisfy and ensure that wealth and name stays within the family, they will break every rule under the sun. What Oscar is doing is parodying that class, that society. He is saying, for all your quality of behavior, for all the way you eat, you dress, you live, the beautiful townhouses, the wonderful country estates, for all of that, you're just stock breeding dirt farmers. And this is the truth of your behavior. And while doing that, he did it so brilliantly, so cleverly, that he made them laugh at themselves, that he was ridiculing the very audience that he was writing for. Because we have to look at what that audience was. He was, if you like, the village playwright for the richest village on earth. That village was Mayfair. And the wealth of the world lived in that village. It was, you think the Hamptons are rich? Oh, no comparison. Mayfair contained the world's richest people, because at that point, the British Empire was almost at its height, the apogee of power and success. Victoria was not, she might have been Queen of England and Scotland, but she was Empress of India. They gave her her weight in diamonds on her Golden Jubilee, or her Diamond Jubilee. She ruled over the greatest empire the world at that stage had ever known. And that wonderful little saying about the sun never sets on the British Empire was absolutely true. At any point in a 24-hour cycle, the sun was shining over a piece of the British Empire. It was vast. There had been nothing like it since the Roman Empire, and it was infinitely bigger. No empire has ever been so big. This little island had dominated the world because they were very clever business people, and they were very clever soldiers. And that wealth, to a large extent, was centered in Mayfair, that village. And that village had a couple of village halls where they go and see plays. And one of them was the St. James Theatre, and the other was the Haymarket Theatre. One of them's gone. The St. James is gone, but the Haymarket is still there. That's where Oscar put the plays on. That's where his plays were staged. And that's where they went and flocked and loved them. They went and one often wonders, did they actually realize that they were looking at themselves being mocked brutally and viciously, not by an English writer of comedy, but by an Irish writer of satire? And that's the point. It was an Irishman's jaundiced view of English society. But he was also laying down a whole new set of rules, in a way, through his writing, of what you could get away with, what you could say, and how you could say it with great subtlety. He was inadvertently, possibly, certainly without any particular foresight, changing the ground rules of writing of comedy and writing of satire for the English theatre forever, just as his co-Dubliner and contemporary, which we'll talk about next week, was doing the same politically. Oscar was doing it through comedy and the ridicule of society. There is a second C in this, and that is corruption. As mentioning Lord Acton's, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And power is wealth, and wealth is a corrupting influence. To be successful, one must be wealthy. To gain wealth, one must be prepared to take risks and to do things that are less than socially acceptable. So Oscar wrote a play and called it An Ideal Husband. And in it we have a character, Sir Robert Chiltern, who is the epitome of Victorian decency, a good man, a decent man, a politician who is noble and honest and decent, with a wife who is even nobler, honester, and decenter. Gertrude Chiltern is possibly one of the most difficult women any man could ever wish to live with, because she is virtue personified and her own ideal of that which is pure. No man, Oscar once said in his youth, I find it difficult to live up to my blue china. Sir Robert Chiltern found it remarkably difficult to live up to his wife. Anyway, Sir Robert, who we begin the play with this wonderful man, wonderful, decent man, and a woman comes to visit at a ball he is giving, and her name is Mrs. Cheveley, and she knew Lady Chiltern, Gertrude, when they were girls in school together. And Mrs. Cheveley is what one might describe as a woman of experience. She has been out in the world. And during her time out in the world, she's met one of the most fascinating characters in Oscar Wilde. And the one character I would kill to play, and most senior actors would always say, in Oscar Wilde, what would you really like to play? And he never appears in a play. He's only ever talked about, and his name is Baron Arnheim. And I always have this image of Orson Welles in his later years as this evil baron. But anyway, beside the point. What we have is a situation of this decent moral man who is about to go into Parliament and condemn what is clearly a corrupt business deal. And he's had it investigated, and a report has come in saying this deal is called the Argentinian Canal Scheme. And the reporter said, no, this is corrupt, this is immoral, this is a scam to get people to invest money in something that is going to collapse. And Mrs. Cheveley comes and says, you're not going to actually make that speech in Parliament. And he says, of course I am. And she says, no, you're not. Because if you do, I'm going to destroy you. How do you mean? And again, I'm going to read the speech because I can never paraphrase as well as Oscar wrote. Not a year passes in England without somebody disappearing. Scandals used to lend charm or at least interest to a man. Now they crush him. Look at that. Just look at that phrase. Scandals used to lend charm or at least interest to a man. Now they crush him. Now, I know this kind of thing could never happen in American politics. This is purely about English politics at the end of the 19th century. Such things could never happen in America. As we know, all our politicians are way above any kind of moral inappropriateness. But just for a moment, just imagine for a moment that you think about a scandal that brought a president a few years back to impeachment over sexual activity, and then think back to Camelot period and a certain president who managed to have more affairs per hour than most of us would have in a lifetime. However, scandal used to lend charm or at least interest to a man. Now they crush him. Prophecy, prophecy. Yours, this is concerning Sir Robert, is a very nasty scandal. You couldn't survive it. If it were known that as a young man, secretary to a great and important minister, you sold a cabinet secret for a large sum of money, and that was the origin of your wealth and career, you would be hounded out of public life. You would disappear completely. And after all, Sir Robert, why should you sacrifice your entire future than deal diplomatically with your enemy? And I, she goes on, am your enemy. So here we have, straight up, the most wonderful proposition. We have a politician, a good man, doing good things, who at some point in his past did something really stupid. And if there is one thing when you get to my age you realize about your past is it's always waiting to catch up with you. Oscar understood that. That behind every, the old adage, behind every great man is a great woman. No, behind every great man there's a scandal waiting to break out. And it is true of everybody. And it's very often a woman who'll break it. What Oscar is saying is nobody is perfect. Nobody is ideal. Everybody has guilt behind them. But we wallpaper over it. We paint over it. We pretend it isn't there. We never confront it. And if we don't confront it, it will come to haunt us. And it doesn't mean that because a man does a bad thing that he's essentially a bad man. Because in Victorian society, if you were exposed, you basically went and shot yourself, because that was the only way out of it. So Robert Chilton himself tries to explain to his wife, and I love this because of the hollowness, the emptiness of it, the desperation that lies within it, the desperation to maintain the facade. He says to his wife, Gertrude, I love this phrase, truth is a very complex thing. And politics is a very complex business. There are wheels within wheels. One may be under certain obligations to people that one must pay. Sooner or later in political life, one has to compromise. Everyone does. How many politicians does that apply to in your awareness of how politics works? We're in a general election year. We're running into all those emails and those web pages and things that are going to come pouring at us as to who we should vote for and who is morally best person, it's going to be full of it. And yet every single person standing for election has something somewhere and somebody waiting to expose it. And we, to be fair, we are the monsters. We are the ravenous, hungry monsters waiting to hear about it. Nothing delights us more than a scandal about somebody. He goes on and talks to his friend, Lord Goring. He says, do you think that what I did nearly 18 years ago should be brought up against me now? Yes. Do you think it fair that a man's whole career should be ruined for a fault done in one's boyhood almost? Oh yeah, unless it's us. I mean, if it's me, no, it shouldn't. But everybody else, oh yeah. I was 22 at the time. Nobody knows what they're doing at the age of 22, believe me. And I had a double misfortune, here's the clincher, of being well-born and poor. Two unforgivable things nowadays. And let's go back to the aristocracy. To be well-born, to be born of the aristocratic class, and poor. Because if you are of the upper class, it assumes that you must have wealth, because only by wealth can you progress. He was well-born and poor. Is it fair that the folly, the sin of one's youth, if men choose to call it a sin, should wreck a life like mine, should place me in a pillory? Should I shatter all I've worked for, all that I've built up? Is it fair? And of course the answer is no, it's not fair. But that's the way the world works. And as much as we try to paper over those cracks will keep appearing. Now, I think what Oscar is in a way saying is, admit your failings, admit your weakness, get it out there, let people judge you for what you do because you have been honest about what you have done. But it's never easy. In fact, it's almost impossible. And well over 100 years after Oscar wrote those words, the truth is still there. The truth is that we are afraid of not papering over the cracks. We are afraid of not painting over our mistakes. We're afraid of the truth. And he sums it up in a rather brilliant phrase. Every man of ambition has to fight his century with its own weapons. That was so profound. This is not a playwright talking. This is a philosopher talking, and it's an Irish philosopher as well. What this century worships, and this is the late 19th century, what this century worships is wealth. And if you don't believe that's still true, you're a fool. The god of this century is wealth. To succeed, one must have wealth. At all costs, one must have wealth. And the answer to the conundrum of, well, why did you sell yourself? He responds, I did not sell myself for money. And this is the clincher. And I think it is true of so many involved in politics and business. I did not sell myself for money. I bought success at a great price. It's a wonderful inversion. Yet again, Oscar's capacity for inversion. I did not sell myself for money. I bought success at a great price. And the great price he bought it for was his soul. So Oscar is the genius of this, and the satirist at play, and the great storyteller at play, is that Oscar is not taking sides at this moment. He is laying it out as it is. Two great friends, one of whom has done a despicable thing in his youth, and the other, who is still young, saying that was despicable. And Oscar is not making a judgment. He is saying, you judge, you decide. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Am I weak or am I strong? We condemn people who do things like that as being weak. But Oscar yet again, puts forward a proposition because he's satirizing not merely the characters, but you, the audience. Do you really think that it is weakness that yields to temptation? There are terrible temptations that require strength and courage to yield to stake all one's life on a single moment, to risk everything on one throw, whether the stake be power or pleasure. There is no weakness in that. It is a terrible courage. And I had that courage. And that is also a great truth. Oscar doesn't make it easy for us by saying, well, it's good or it's bad. He is not a writer of light comedy. He is a writer of savage satire. And that moment of admission by Sir Robert Chiltern to his friend Lord Goring, I have done a corrupt thing. He's also saying, but I did it for the right reasons. And it is for you to judge, and for his obnoxiously pure wife to judge whether that was justified or not, whether it was right or not. But everything that Oscar lays out, all the evidence he lays out, it's all true. It's all real. And we ask ourselves in these days, well, how can somebody who is a member of Congress for their entire working career end up as a multi-millionaire? How does that happen? Are you telling me that there is no corruption? I'm not saying there is. I'm simply saying, how do they do it? I wish I knew, because I'd love to be a multimillionaire. So Oscar understood the nature of power. He understood hubris. He understood corruption. And let us go back to his education. Of course he did. Because he was an Irishman and he had that natural cynicism of the British aristocracy and British upper classes. But he had also been in Oxford, a student of ancient Greek and Romans. He understood from the earliest perceptions, the earliest theatrical perceptions of Sophocles, for instance, of the way that art can look at life and question it and say, are you right? Are you good? Are you moral? Are you decent? And in fact, on those terms, what is morality? Does all of those Greek heroes and heroines, do they have the right to make the choices they make? Do they have the right to do the things that they do? What is right? What is wrong? What is good? What is bad? Evil is a different thing. Oscar himself was corrupt. Oscar, by their terms, by their standards, Oscar lived a corrupt life. And it was once his own corruption was discovered, the society that he had lampooned, that he had satirized, that had laughed at his plays and adored him, savagely punished him. The society that he had ridiculed him back. And the great joke they played on him was that he was imprisoned for gross indecency and suffered 2 years of hard labor in a Victorian prison. Unimaginable. Unimaginable. Once the prison sentence was over, he exiled himself in France. He could no longer live in London. He could no longer live in society. He couldn't write anymore. He tried, he couldn't. He died there, bereft of family. Most of his friends had gone, and in the one state of being that he had already established as being the worst state you could be in, poverty. Society that he had ridiculed, come back to that word again, punished him to death. And yet, my belief, he fostered a huge resurgence in English satire. And every writer of intelligent comedy since is deeply in his debt. The Importance of Ernest probably remains one of the greatest comedies ever written because of its satire as much as his wit. But the inheritance of that, of that work and that approach to the nature of humanity changed the way that plays were written, and the immediate one after Oscar, if you look at the writings of Noel Coward, yes, they're very funny plays, but they are also savagely satiric about the nature of the upper middle classes in England. Anyway, that's the major point for today's talk. That's the influence I believe Oscar had, and why he had such an influence, that he was not merely a comedy writer, but he was a satirist and a political writer as well. So let's have a look at whatever questions are coming in. I've got a couple here that that's a good question. Did Oscar's sense of humor come from his mother or his father? His father, I don't think, was a great wit. Oscar was done for sexual misconduct. So was his father. There was the case of a woman who brought a case against him that he sexually, shall we say, molested her while she was in his medical study, and brought him to court and sued him. And he won the case and was awarded damages, but the court believed him so much that they awarded him 1/2 penny in damages. In other words, he did it, but he couldn't be proved to have done it. I don't think he had a great sense of humor. His mother, Oscar's mother, Speranza, had a brilliant sense of humor. She was full of wit, full of charm. She was a great joker, and I think it was there from her genetic background that Oscar probably inherited his sense of wit, but also from the way she wrote and talked herself. Some people have sent in some of the great quotes of Oscar, and as I say, epigrams there are books of it. I have shelves over there full of Oscar Wilde. More has been written about Oscar, probably, with the exception of Shakespeare, of any other writer. The question, how did the English feel about the satire of the Englishman? I don't think they noticed until it was over. But once society realized that he had exposed them, and he exposed them in a very interesting way. The night that he was arrested, after the fall of the first trial was where he sued the Marquis of Queensberry and lost. And the Marquis of Queensberry proved that Oscar was in fact posing as a sodomite. And that night after the trial, Oscar was arrested. On that night, now normally on the ferry from Dover to Dieppe, maybe 10 or 20 young English gentlemen would take that trip on any given night. On the night he was arrested, something like 200 fled the country. In other words, everyone knew the game was up, and that that Oscar had, everybody was doing it. One of the judges, the unfortunate name of Justice Darling, had a son who was known to be homosexual. It was perfectly rife, and just nobody talked about it. Nobody did. If you don't do it it was the old same as the American military. If you don't tell, we'll get away with it. Oscar told, or at least made it so obvious that he exposed an awful lot of the aristocracy of high society to the possibility of arrest, and for that they never forgave him. So, yeah, they punished him. Yes, I quite like that. Be yourself, everyone else is taken. And what other, have we got other questions coming in? What do I think of Rupert Everett and Stephen Fry's portrayal of Oscar? Now, of course, they're wonderful. I don't think they're accurate. And one of the blessings of my life, the people I've met quite a few people in my time, and one of the people I can call friend is Merlin Holland, who's Oscar Wilde's grandson. Merlin's, I think, about 2 years older than me. He was the son of Vivian Holland, Oscar's second son. He never knew Oscar, obviously, because Oscar died in 1900. Merlin was born in 1947. But I remember we talked about this, and we sort of both agreed that both actors gave interesting interpretations of an aspect of Oscar, but I don't believe that either of them really got the complexity of the character. But there's a limit to what you can do in any given thing. Stephen Fry is an incredible talent. Rupert Everett is an incredible talent. Stephen Fry is a brilliant raconteur, and incredibly learned. He is in many ways Oscaranian, but I don't think his performance was great. In that it was good, but it wasn't great. It didn't reach the. I think it didn't reach down to the Irishness of Oscar. And there's a very important thing. I mean, Oscar himself said, he was asked, about being English. He said, "I'm not English. I am Irish, and cursed to speak the language of Shakespeare and the Bible." He was very conscious of his own nationality, that he was an Irishman. He talked about, Ireland will never be a nation until it has a national theatre. He wasn't talking about a building. He was talking about that Ireland should stop writing plays for England and start writing plays for Ireland. And he was condemning himself with that very thought. And he was condemning Shaw as well. Shaw only ever was asked by W.B. Yeats to write something for the Abbey Theatre when it was first established. And Shaw wrote a play called John Bull's Other Island. And it was the only truly Irish play that he wrote. But Oscar prophetically said he was something of a prophet. He was a philosopher. Ireland would only ever be a nation when it had a national theatre. In other words, a nation of Irish playwrights writing plays for Ireland, which eventually came. It came with O'Casey all the way through to the present day. One of my 3 top favorite Wilde plays. Importance of Being Earnest, as I say, is probably the greatest comedy, pure comedy ever written, quickly followed by Noel Coward's Private Lives. I think Lady Windermere's Fan is a beautiful play, but I think An Ideal Husband is the epitome of political satire. And my third favorite play is one I have not mentioned, but I will come back to in a later lecture after this series of talks is over, and that is Salome, which is a prose poem of such beauty. And I was very privileged. I was in that production at the Gate Theatre, which we kept reviving for 20 years, playing Herod, and which I also directed. The first time I directed a play for PICT, it was Salome. So those 3, I think, would be Ernest, Ideal Husband, and Salome. And when I say I'll talk about them again, just to say that when this series of lectures is over, I'm going to do 3 more on Oscar Wilde, on the different aspects of Oscar. So that's something to, if you're interested, I was going to say to look forward to, but to expect. Anyway, there's an interesting two questions. Why did people kiss the beautiful sculpture at his grave in Paris? Yeah, it became a problem, actually. They kept having to clean it. The amount of lipstick that ended up his grave in Paris. When he died, he was buried in Berneval, and then after Bosie Douglas, it's not Bosie Douglas, God no, Robbie Ross, who was his dearest friend. Robbie Ross raised money and purchased a grave in Père Lachaise, and commissioned Epstein, the sculptor, to do the gravestone. This wonderful angel. And in fact, the grave is not owned by the Wilde family. Merlin doesn't own it. It was Robbie Ross's estate that it went to. And if you go around the back of it, you'll see a little grill thing at the back, and that's where Robbie Ross's ashes are. So he had the grave moved to Père Lachaise. I think people kiss it as an act of worship. It is worshipping of what I think one might describe as a corrupt body, but a pure soul. I think that's why they do it. What's the wrong way to perform Oscar Wilde? What is the wrong way to perform Wilde? As if the plays were written by an English writer of comedy. You must understand that they are written by an Irish writer of satire. And you must play them as not comedy. One of the great rules of acting comedy is don't play comedy, play the story. And that's even true of the importance of being earnest. Lady Bracknell is not funny because she tells jokes. She's funny because of the way she uses language and condemns everybody. There's a wonderful moment when she turns up in the final act, and I think it's Jack says, "Well, what are you doing? How did you know we were here?" Whatever it is. And she has this one. She manages to insult 4 insults in the space of one phrase. Apprised of my daughter's sudden flight by her trusty maid, whose confidence I purchased by means of a small coin. In other words, the trusty maid could be bought off for nothing. That's brilliant writing. That is genius writing. You play that for all the maliciousness that it's worth. You don't try to make it funny. Never try to make Oscar funny. He already is, and he's much funnier than you could ever be. So, Sean, you have a thing there. I assume Wilde lifted or adapted the notion of Dorian Gray from an earlier story. Oh, yes, but there's nothing new in theatre. There is nothing new under the sun. There are no original ideas. We all steal from the past. We are storytellers. And so the story has been told a million times. Shakespeare wrote a play about a king who believed that he had absolute authority, but didn't need to take any responsibility. Now, I know we couldn't imagine any national leader like that today, but I'm sure that somebody will be writing a play about our dear president at some point. Nothing is new. Dorian was lifted from various different sources, and I'm not going to go into them now because I will be talking again about it. But there were various books that influenced him. One was a book by a guy called Huysman called À Rebours, which is a wonderful book, and if you can find it, you should read it. It's about a guy who isolates himself away and becomes the most completely self-indulgent person that the world has ever seen. Oscar was fascinated by that. So yeah, he lifted just like Shakespeare. Shakespeare lifted all his plots. Oscar lifted a lot of his, but converted it into something that was wonderful and the closest thing to original as you could wish for. Okay, we're running out of time. In fact, we've technically gone 15 minutes over our time. Sorry about that. No, I'm not. So we have the trivia question for this week. And it's slightly harder because we think the last two were far too easy. So here it comes. It's an Oscar Wilde trivia question. After the first trial, the trial where Oscar was prosecuting the Marquis of Queensberry, and Oscar lost, and they knew that he'd had it. And lots of friends said, go to France now. Frank Harris actually had a boat waiting for him on the south coast to take him to France. But Oscar said, no, I am not running away. I am going to stay. And he and Pozzo went off, and he was arrested. The police came and arrested him. Famously, Oscar was drinking hock and seltzer with Pozzo. What was the hotel where they drank the hock and seltzer? It's not just a geographic question, it is literary, because a certain British poet laureate wrote a poem about it. So the trivia question is, which hotel was Oscar drinking hock and seltzer in on the night he was arrested? There's your question. Okay, that's it for today, except to say thank you for being with me. Thank you for putting up with me. Next week, we will be talking about George Bernard Shaw, who was a contemporary of Oscar, but lived about 50 years longer. If you can, in any way, shape, or form, help support us, we will be eternally grateful. We cannot sell tickets to anything at the moment. Our income is incredibly limited. We still have to maintain the office. We still have to maintain the operation. We're down to a skeleton staff, but we've still got to try to produce as much as we can and plan for what we will hope will be a fall season starting in the fall, and at worst starting in the new year. But your donations really do matter, and anything you can give to us, please do. We will be so grateful. And while we're at it, do continue to support all the other activities that Pittsburgh Arts is putting out for your entertainment. And thank you for being with me. See you next week. Bye-bye.